Hi everyone, my name is Charlie and today I have my Victober wrap-up. If you didn't know, Victober is a month-long read-along hosted by Katie of Books and Things, Lucy the Reader and Kate Howe, and is a month in which we all come together and celebrate Victorian literature. This year there were a few prompts, I can't remember what they were, I don't know whether I managed to hit any of those prompts. I did read more than just Victorian literature in October, but for the purposes of today's video, I will be sticking to the Victorian literature that I read in the month of October. This month, I said I wasn't going to put too much pressure on myself, and I can tell you now that I didn't manage to read all of the books that I intended to read, and I didn't manage to get to any of the extra books I added as the month went on. But to begin, I did read some of the Penguin Little Black classics last month, so I will run through them quite quickly because I don't have a lot to say. Firstly, I have The Old Nurse's Story by Elizabeth Gaskell. This also features the short story Curious If True. The Old Nurse's Story is one that I chose to read in bed at the start of October, and it is one of very few stories that has managed to put a tiny bit of terror in me. I forgot when Victorian stories are set at Christmas time, often they will have ghosts in them because they still held this idea of something being a bit spiritual around Christmas, you know, Yule, and the whole thing of the portals between the worlds being somewhat thinner. And so there is a tiny bit of terror in this where there is a mention of a possible young girl's ghost, and something about child ghosts just hit me in that place that is just a tiny bit terrifying, and I was impressed. I was finally glad that whilst modern horror fiction hasn't managed to scare me, Elizabeth Gaskell did. Then we moved on to Curious If True, and I felt the same way about Curious If True as I did about Charles Dickens' story A Christmas Tree, in which I liked what was being said, but I didn't necessarily care for the story. It had some very good writing in there from Gaskell, but I just wasn't as impressed as I have been before. And I think that The Old Nurse's Story was to blame for that because I had enjoyed it so much. Next, we move on to The Great Winglebury Duel by Charles Dickens. This made me laugh a lot. There are some moments in this little story that had me stood in the shop just laughing because I was taking them to work with me every day. In this one, it's very much a case of mistaken identity all the time. And I should say that this story, I believe, was also featured in Sketches by Boz, which I have on one of these collections behind me. I loved it. The sense of comedic timing in here is brilliant, and I think that this comes from the start of Charles Dickens' career, and I think that Charles Dickens' humour was strongest at the start of his career. As it moves on, it becomes a lot more subtle, but here it was brilliant. We move on to The Night is Darkening Around Me, a selection of poems by Emily Bronte. Again, we've got a lot of death here. A lot of death from Emily Bronte in this story. I prefer her poetry to her prose, so I was glad for these mediations on death. Not so much here for the ones about religion, but that's just who I am. Then we had A Hippo Banquet by Mary Kingsley, and I abhor this book, which is only short. I will not be reading the story, the book it comes from, which is Travels in West Africa. Mary Kingsley might have had a problem with the missionaries going across and trying to westernise the people who lived in Africa, but her descriptions of people as savages and the way she spoke about them, she still had some of the same predilections. She still had some of the same prejudices towards black people, and I just, no. Then we have Charles Darwin with It Was Snowing Butterflies. Also got a mild bit of racism in here as well, and I did not care for it. I do not like it. I do not need, like, if you want to go ahead and read these books, that's fine. I'm not going to stop anybody from reading them, but I do not want to be reading books that have racist undertones within them. I do not care what a person might have contributed towards something. I know about that stuff. I know about the history of these people and what they did, but not for me. And then we had Olalla by Robert Louis Stevenson, because I was looking for a book to terrify me, thinking that this was going to be a great vampire story. It was just a great gothic story. It's a gothic romance, really, and it's not something that I will ever revisit. Let us move on to the 4 actual books, tomes that I read in Victober. Firstly, we have The Law and the Lady by Wilkie Collins, and this is on my list of favourite books of the year. Firstly, I should say that I am not too happy about the villainisation of a character with physical deformities in here. That has been a big discussion recently, and in a lot of years. You only have to go over to Jen Campbell's recent video to see why. And I will admit that that did leave a sour taste in my mouth due to the portrayal of this character. However, what got me about this story was the way it felt like I was reading a modern thriller, and I sped through this book in a matter of days. I read this book so quickly that I really felt hopeful about Victober and thought I was going to be able to get through everything else just as quickly due to the pace and the style of this book. We have short chapters, crisp prose. It was fantastic. This story follows Valeria Woodville, and upon marrying her husband, she discovers a secret from his past. It is linked to a crime that happened a few years before, and Valeria makes it her mission to find out the truth of this crime. You know I love a detective story, and I love a female sleuth. So this had everything I like in a book set in Victorian times. Of course, I've mentioned the villainisation of this character with a physical deformity, but Valeria is a character who still strives to get what she wants. She's incredibly independent, regardless of the fact that men are still very much deciding what their wives can do and are expecting her to be silent. You have this very pompous gentleman who is a bit desperate, really, to keep Valeria in the dark. But she is persistent. It goes back to the crime that happened. It tells stories in that very Victorian way of slipping out of the main narrative to go back in time to show us court transcripts and that sort of thing. I don't know what more I can say about this. I said about creating this entire review around this book, but it would have just been me being incredibly enthusiastic about the character of Valeria, how I look forward to reading more of Wilkie Collins' work in future, because after reading The Haunted Hotel last year, I didn't think this was a writer for me. I still have The Moonstone to read and The Woman in White. It's worth exploring a writer's backlog, I suppose, and I am very grateful to Kate Howe for the recommendation of this book, because it just suited my tastes entirely. I loved seeing this incredibly strong, forthright woman at the forefront of a Victorian novel in which, yes, it's still got the romance and love and adoration there, but at its heart, it's a detective story with an independent heroine, which was lacking, I think, at the time. Then we move on to my reread of The Tenant of Wildfell Hall by Anne Bronte. This was going to be part of a video I did called The Week of the Brontes. Naturally, I ended up with overtime at work, and so I didn't read Shirley and I didn't read Jane Eyre, and I had to push them off my TBR for last month. The Tenant of Wildfell Hall sees the character of Helen, who has come to inhabit Wildfell Hall, and there is a mystery surrounding her character. I recall Helen being completely different when I read this book 12 years ago. And I think when I first read this book, it was at the same time I was reading Twilight, and I was reading a lot of young adult paranormal romance, and this featured a lot of rambling prose that really went into the character's mind and was a bit more insightful into the character's mind as opposed to the action. Over time, I've come to prefer books that show emotion and thoughts through dialogue and through the characters' actions, as opposed to being so in the heads of the characters. This book feels very much like a reverie in the second part, once we go back to hear more of Helen's history. Still, this book has glimpses of Helen becoming more of this character that I remember, which was somewhat strong enough to leave her husband, who was a bit of a drunk, and he was a womanizer and he was off spending his money all the time, leaving her alone in this house. I still like Anne Bronte's prose. I think that I prefer this to Agnes Grey because of the length of it and the depth she goes to describe her characters. But I think my memory of this book and the fact that I read it around the same time I was first reading Wuthering Heights and I didn't like Wuthering Heights, so this was always going to be the better one. I think that this was somewhat heightened in my memory. Anne Bronte can definitely write. I loved her descriptions in here, and some of the sparks of Hallam in this book were just fantastic. But I do dislike the climax into the denouement. I think it's a very convenient ending, is what I will say. However, something that kept happening whilst I was reading this book and nearly inspired a video but I couldn't find enough songs was modern pop music that could fit a Victorian novel. And what I would like everyone to do is go and listen to Delta Goodrum's song Alcohol. As soon as I'd finished reading this book, that song kept running through my mind. And when I re-listened to it, this became a book that I now associate with that song. Go and listen to that song and tell me if I'm reading too much into it. Then we have George Silverman's Explanation by Charles Dickens, which features 3 stories, which I will have to read the back of because I can't remember them. We have George Silverman's Explanation, A Holiday Romance, and Hunted Down. George Silverman's Explanation, I don't know what he was explaining. I don't know what Dickens was getting at. I can't say any fairer than that. No idea what the man was talking about. A Holiday Romance is various children telling stories as though they're adults, and was probably very nice around Christmas time back in the day, but did nothing for me. Yeah, I can't even say if I'd have enjoyed it as a child. It seemed weird, surreal even. And then we had Hunted Down, which was Charles Dickens taking on a detective story, and wow. Well. It had some pace to it, but it was no Law and the Lady. And flaming it, I don't know what Dickens gets at and what he means when he does certain things to his villains. I've seen it a few times, and he seems to have a very, again, convenient. He has a idea in his head of what should happen to villains, and it's happened to a few of his villains now. Is all I'll say with relation to Hunted Down. And then we have The Warden by Anthony Trollope. This is the first book in the Barsetshire series, and people have been telling me that I will like this series for years. Doris, of all the books, mentioned one of the later books in one of her reading vlogs. And if you didn't know, Doris creates some of the best reading vlogs that are available on YouTube. Every time I watch them, I get jealous of something, be it the scenery she includes, or the books she's reading, or just the cats, because if you didn't know, I'm allergic to cats, so I get that second-hand glimpse of cat adoration there. I suppose the only animal that I don't really like are chickens. Anyway, with that in mind, Doris was reading one of the later books in Anthony Trollope's series, and in somewhat of a jealous pique, I picked up The Warden, and I read it in one day. And Mary Ann Moronsky got in touch with me asking whether I'd want to buddy read it with her, and I had to apologise because I'd already read it. And do you know what? Everyone was right. I did love it. I think that later books in the series are going to be better. Sarah over at Hardcover Hearts also read this book recently, and I can see where she's coming from. I think that Anthony Trollope is a writer who's going to get better as he progresses. What I liked about this story was its quietness, and I think it's a story. I heard Brian over at Bookish once describe this as an introduction to the series, and I can understand that. But I did like the prose, and I like the characters and the way they interacted with each other. I like the daughter's worries over what would happen to her father. The ending of this story reminded me of that scene that people show where Wile E. Coyote finally manages to catch Roadrunner, and he holds up the sign that says, "Now what?" Because everything that people set out to do is achieved in this story, but it feels much like the people in charge are getting their own back, and it feels like some sort of sweet revenge in the end. It talks about society at the time, it's got humour in there, and it also mocks Charles Dickens, so What more could we ask for in a book, really? Now, one of the things I was reading throughout the month, and I didn't continue to read as much as I wanted, was Sylvias Lovers by Elizabeth Gaskell. This is a book that I've been dipping in and out of for nearly a month now. It's not that I dislike the story, it's that I decided to take it slowly and mull over it a bit more. I found that's heightened the experience for me. I don't know how to describe the love and romantic situation here. You have one character who is in love with another character who happens to be in love with Sylvia, who is in love with another character. But I remember there being 5 characters who were in love here. Oh, that's it. So we've got one character who's in love with another character who's in love with another character who's in love with Sylvia who's in love with another character. That was it. 5 people, this weird tangled web of love and romance, and I kept saying throughout reading I could see this turned into some sort of modern drama, but I would also love to see an adaptation of this story. I kind of like the melodrama of it all and the sense of impending tragedy that permeates throughout the entire novel. I see on the back that Gaskell said that this was her saddest story, and I can guess why that's going to be, but it doesn't stop her from capturing this sense of place very well. I've travelled to Whitby, it's one of my favourite places, and seeing it captured again in Monkshaven is fantastic. And the characters that she mentions living the farm life also thrill me because, as you know, I'm the son of a farmer. I come from a farming background despite not caring for farming myself, and it's just that idea. I think she's captured the farming community and the way they operate incredibly well, and so I'm looking forward to continuing and finishing Sylvia's Lovers in November instead. The other books that I didn't get to, of course, I wanted to read Barchester Towers by Trollope. I didn't do that. I didn't read Mary Seacole's book, nor did I read Shirley or Jane Eyre. But the great thing is I own those books, so I can read them whenever I care to. If you followed my vlogs throughout Victober, I'm happy and I'm grateful, and I hope that you enjoyed seeing me battle trying to get all of these books read. And I look forward to exploring more Victorian literature outside of Victober. If you've read any of these books and would like to discuss them, then please feel free to do so in the comments. And until next time, that is all.